Hello and welcome to my Swift tutorial for beginners. In this video, I want to tell you all about optionals, which are probably one of the most confusing topics for beginners. If you've ever looked at Swift code and come across exclamation marks or question marks, then you've come across optionals. So let's get started and find out what they're all about. So to demonstrate what an optional is, let's first take a look at how we've been declaring our variables and constants. As you remember, whenever we declare a variable, we use var and then we use some sort of name. Let's just say a for this example. And up till this point, you've always seen me assign something into my variable declaration. Something like this. Or whether I declare, a string, I'm always assigning a piece of data into my variable declaration or constant declaration right away. Now, there will be instances when you're building apps that you may not want to assign data to your variable right away. You might just want to declare it. But if we try to do that, let's erase this assignment statement and erase the data as well and just leave it at that. You'll see that Xcode really doesn't like that. And that's because it wants to make sure that all of your variables and constants actually are keeping track of some sort of data, because that's the purpose of the variable and the constant, right? Well, using optionals, you can create a situation where you declare a variable or a constant without assigning something to it first, in which case it is empty. So how do you define emptiness? Well, there's actually a type for empty, and it's called nil. And it's simply a keyword like that, NIL, which stands for empty or nothing. Now, if we don't want to assign actual data to our variable first, we can assign it nil, like that, right? And that means that that variable contains nothing. However, as you can see, we're still having some problems here. Remember I told you about data types for variables and how variables can only store data of a certain data type, and you can explicitly state the data type of that variable, and if you don't, then it's going to take on the data type of the first piece of data that you assign to it. So for example, for A, if I did that, then it would take the data type of my integer and it would determine that A should have the data type of int. In the case of nil, however, there is no data type for empty, and so variable A really doesn't have a data type right now, and we have to give our variable a data type. So in this case, if you're going to assign empty into your variable, that means you don't want to put any data into it yet. We have to explicitly put a data type. Now let's go ahead and put int, right? And for this one, let's put string, like that. Let's run it. As you can see, there is still a problem because the int data type doesn't include empty. In fact, none of the data types include nil as a valid value. The nil is not a valid integer, and nil is also not a valid string. So that's why we can't assign nil to an integer variable, and we can't assign nil to a string variable. Well, this is where optionals come in. By adding a question mark to the data type like this, this becomes an optional integer, which means that it could either be an integer or it could be nil. Same thing goes for this right here. The data type is now, it's not string, it's an optional string, which means that it could contain a string object or it might contain nil. So that's the gist of an optional. In order to demonstrate how to work with optionals, I'm going to use another example. So let me delete this for now, and then let me grab a piece of code that I prepared for you. Let me just run the project here and make sure that it runs. As you can see here, I have a class called Christmas present, and this class contains a function called surprise, which returns an integer. Now this integer is going to be a random number from 1 to 10. So why don't we just use this code here. Let's use let present equals, let's create a new Christmas present object using that. Remember initializer functions, right? And then we want to activate the surprise. So, present dot surprise, and then we're going to print the output of that function. So let's run our code, and we get 5 in our console right here. So that's the surprise. Now, this data type of this constant right here, if I explicitly declare it, would be the type of my class, right? Next, why don't we make this an optional type by adding the question mark there? And then let's say that we put nil in there. You can see here that there's an error. Xcode says that the value of optional type Christmas present must be unwrapped to refer to the member. Think of member as function or property. Must be unwrapped to refer to the function surprise, right? And the reason for this is because I told you with an optional data type, this constant could contain a Christmas present object, or it could contain nil. And in this case, we do know that it contains nil. So what that means is that you have to check that optional constant or optional variable to see if it actually contains an object or if it contains nil before you access any of its functions or properties, because you can't call a function on empty, right? You can't access a property of nil. So what we have to do in this case is just double check that the constant present actually contains an object, a Christmas present object to be specific, before we call the surprise function on it. Now there are several ways of checking an optional type to see if it's nil before using it, and I'll demonstrate some of them. Let me erase this line first. So we are going to check the optional to see if an object exists, or if it contains an object. Let's say it like that. So the first thing we can do is basically compare it to nil with an if statement. So if present is equal to nil, if this is true, then it contains nil. So don't do anything with it. Else, it contains an object, right? Now the reverse of this is also true. You can check if present not equal to nil, right? Then if it's not equal to nil, then it contains an object. So why don't we use this statement here, because we want to only call the surprise function if there is an object, and we don't really need to do anything with it if it is a nil. So why don't we erase this one here, and let's use this one. So it contains an object. Now call the surprise function. Now, since I have already checked that it contains an object, I should be able to just call surprise, right? You'll notice that Xcode has helped us put this question mark here because that's what it thinks you want to do. But I'm going to erase it because I want to demonstrate something for you. See, if I try to run this, there's an error because you see, with an optional variable or an optional constant, before you can actually access the value inside that optional data type, whether that's an actual object or whether that's nil, you have to unwrap that optional. Now I know that's a weird term, but a good analogy or a good metaphor to think about an optional variable is that it's like a Christmas present, or it's like a box, and you don't know what's inside of it. It could actually contain an object or it could be nil, but you're never going to know unless you unwrap it first. You open that box to see what's inside. Now right here, you might say, hey, we've already checked that it's not nil, right? So this check is kind of like taking that box and just shaking it and listening to it. You know, when you're a kid? trying to find out what's inside your present, that's what that's like. And all that does is that it tells you if there's something inside. I mean, if it's nil, you're shaking it, it's not going to sound like anything. But if there's an actual object inside and you shake it, you'll hear something. So this check right here lets you know that there is something inside. But that doesn't mean that you can access what's inside, right? Until you unwrap it. So let me show you how you can unwrap that variable and get at the object so that you can call the surprise function on it. All you have to do to unwrap this optional variable is use the exclamation mark after it. And what that does is it tears open that box and you get whatever's inside, whether that is the actual Christmas present object or whether that's nil. So because we've already checked here that it is an object, I'm going to say dot surprise. And I can print that. Right, so let's run this statement here. Actually, nothing is going to run. Do you know why? Because it's actually nil, right? So our if statement actually worked. So this if statement said, if it's not nil, right, then unwrap it and then call the surprise function on it. But since it is nil, it didn't do anything. So why don't we change this statement? Why don't we actually put a present inside the box? So now when we run it, we're going to get the random number surprise, which is 6. So now you know how optionals work. But I mentioned there are a couple of different ways of checking, right? To see if there's an object inside of your optional. So this is one way. Another way is called optional binding. And this is a little bit more advanced than that basic check there. And it's kind of another way of writing an if statement. So you say if let, let's say actual present equals present, then we will print actual present dot surprise. So let me explain this statement right here. It's still an if statement, so you're checking something. You're actually checking to see if present, this optional variable, to see if it's nil or not. If it is nil, then it's just going to pass through this if statement and not execute the stuff inside. However, if this optional variable does contain an actual object, then it's going to assign it to this constant that you're creating right here called actual present. So it's almost like two statements in one. The if statement checks to see if it's nil. If it's not nil, then you're going to assign the actual object unwrapped into actual present, this constant. And then you can, inside that if statement, you can use actual present as the actual object, because what it will do is that it's going to take the unwrapped object and assign it to actual present. Okay, so you don't have to do any unwrapping here. And then you can just call surprise. So you'll see 6 and 4. 4 was from here and 6 was from here. All right, last thing to show you about optionals is another thing called optional chaining. Now, this is what you saw a little earlier when Xcode tried to put a question mark there. So let me show you what that is. So you put a question mark next to the optional variable, and then you call your method like that. So with optional chaining, you can see we don't have any if statements or anything like that. But basically, what this does is it checks to see if this is going to be nil or if it actually is an object. If this is nil, nothing happens. You're not going to call that function. However, if there is actually an object in there, then it's going to call the next part on that object. So in this case, it's going to call the surprise function on the actual object because there is an object in that optional. So that's what's known as optional chaining. So why do we even have optionals in Swift? Well, the reason is because Swift is a type-safe language. And what this basically means is that Swift forces you, the programmer, to be very specific about the types of data that you're working with in your code. And in the long run, this actually helps you because it forces you to think about things thoroughly, such as if this variable will need to contain nil or if it's always going to have a value. And also how we're restricted to a certain data type for a variable, right? You're not going to accidentally assign another data type to that variable because it is type safe. So I just wanted to revisit some of the ways of declaring our variables and constants with optionals now, because there's one thing that I haven't shown you yet, and that's what I'm going to show you now. So in here, line 3, you see kind of the standard way where we declare a variable with the type, and then we assign data to it. And you've also seen about how you can add the question mark after the data type to turn that into an optional type, and you can assign nil into it. Well, you can also just do this, and that's absolutely fine, because when you declare an optional data type like this for variable C, by default it's going to be nil. So you don't actually have to explicitly assign nil to it. So when you're declaring optionals, I would recommend that you do it this way. There is also another type of optional that you can declare, and that is using the exclamation mark. Now I know in this lesson I showed you that putting an exclamation mark is unwrapping that variable or constant to see what's inside the optional, right? Well, this is called an unwrapped optional. So this allows you to, D can store a string or nil, but it is already unwrapped. So you don't have to unwrap it, but it can also store nil. C can store a string or nil, but it is wrapped. So you have to unwrap it in order to see the contents, whether it's nil or the actual string. So when would you want to use this sort of optional versus this one? Well, I would say in general you would want to use this one because it provides that sort of type safety checking that Xcode has. So when you try to use C in some weird way and you're not checking against nil, Xcode is going to warn you, hey, this is an optional, so you might have to check for nil before using it. You might not be able to call this property or this method on C because it might be empty. So it provides you all of those warnings, which makes you a better programmer, and it makes your code more robust and will probably crash less. So if you use this instead, you can also store nil or values in here, so it gives you that flexibility, but it's not going to have any of that type safety checking. So Xcode is just going to assume that you know what you're doing. It's not going to warn you that it might be nil because it's already unwrapped, right? But just know that D may contain nil. So it's almost like you are driving without a seatbelt. Maybe that's a bad example, but because there are places where you might want to use this, if you know for sure that only initially it may be nil, but then after a certain point you can always be sure that there's a value, then maybe it's safe to use that. And then you can ignore all of that sort of optional binding, optional chaining, all of those checking for nil. You can save all of that code. However, if it's a variable which may contain a value and then nil, and then that value might get erased, so it's nil again and it keeps flipping back and forth, then maybe having it as this sort of optional is better, because then it forces you to remember to do that checking. So I just wanted to give one more quick example about these two kinds of optionals using our Christmas present class. So why don't we declare a new Christmas present like so. Let's say present1 is equal to, well, let's declare the type of this. So we're going to declare a new Christmas present optional like so, and we're going to assign it nil, right? And then we're going to do Christmas present 2, and we're going to use this. And remember, we don't actually have to assign it to nil, but I'm going to write it anyways just so it's very clear to you what's inside these variables right here. So if I wanted to, let's say, do present1.surprise like that, let's remove the optional chaining. You know, we get that sort of type safety checking. It's saying that, hey, it's an optional, it might be nil. If it's nil, then you can't call surprise on it. So make sure you do some sort of checking. However, if I do present to.surprise, you can see that, let me just show you, let me type it out. You can see when I do that, there's no optional chaining there. You don't have to unwrap it at all or anything like that. It just treats it as an unwrapped optional. You can just use it as is, and you're not going to get any sort of warning. So I'm going to run this, but now you get an actual app crash. So, if this goes unchecked and you launch your app and the user is using it, then you're actually going to get an app crash, which is really bad. Whereas if you did it with this sort of optional, even as you're running it, you're going to get a warning from Xcode forcing you to fix that and address that before actually shipping your app, or even allowing you to run your code. So like all the other things we're learning about Swift, we can go deeper. There are additional things that you can learn about optionals, but this is your introduction, and I just wanted to tell you what they are and a little bit about how to use them. Practically speaking, you'll be using them most of the time like how we covered in this lesson. In the future, we'll cover more of the complex aspects of optionals. Also, you might be wondering why and when we would use optionals, but let me tell you, you will definitely come across optionals when you're building apps. And when we get to building our apps together, now you'll know what they are and how they're used because you've watched this lesson. Now, if you like this video, please hit the thumbs up button and hit subscribe if you haven't already. All right, click on over there for the next lesson, and I'll see you there.